He did not know they were coming. That was the part nobody told him. For 22 years, Curtis Deal had pulled Route 9 through the north side of the city, the same 21 stops from the Garfield Transit Hub down through Meridian Avenue and across the Chester Street overpass to the last bench at Wycliffe Park. And in all that time, he had never once been the kind of man who expected anything from anybody. He showed up at 4:45 in the morning. He drove. He called the stops in a voice that was low and unhurried, the way a man sounds when he has been doing a thing long enough that it has become its own kind of prayer. He did not know that on his last morning, at every single stop along that route, someone was already waiting. Think about that for a moment. 22 years, one man, one route, and a city that finally decided it was time to say so. Curtis had put in his retirement papers on a Tuesday in October, quiet as everything else he ever did. He handed the form to the district supervisor, a younger man named Gordon who had been on the job 18 months, and still called the drivers by their badge numbers when he was nervous. Curtis set the paper on the desk, and Gordon looked at it and then looked up and said to process it by end of week. Curtis said thank you. He picked up his thermos and walked back to the yard. He told nobody else. He was not a man who announced things. He was a man who drove. What he did not know was that a woman named Yvonne had overheard him in the break room 2 days before he filed the form. Yvonne ran the Weekend Dispatch window and had ridden Route 9 herself 12 years ago when her son Marcus was small and they lived in the apartment above the pharmacy on Meridian, and Curtis had held the door for the boy every single morning when school was in session, calling out the stop by name in that low, unhurried voice so Marcus would not miss it in the dark. She overheard Curtis telling the mechanic Earl that December 14th would be his last day, and she went home that evening and she made a phone call. Then she made 11 more. Curtis was 57 years old. He had driven a city bus for 22 of those years, the last 16 of them on Route 9. Before the Transit Authority, he had done 2 years loading freight at the rail depot off Clayton, and before that, he had spent 3 years in a machinist apprenticeship that ended when the shop closed and took 40 jobs with it. He had been 19 then, and the city had felt enormous and indifferent, and he had applied to the Transit Authority because the pay was steady, and the health insurance covered his mother, who had a heart condition and lived alone in the house on Dunbar Street where he had grown up. He had not thought of it as a calling. He had thought of it as a job. Something happened to Curtis in that seat, behind that tall windshield, watching the city come awake in the dark at 4:45 in the morning. He found he liked people, not in a loud way. In the way a man likes a thing that is true and ordinary and worth paying attention to. He liked the way the overnight nurses smelled of antiseptic and moved like they were saving energy for something harder. He liked the teenagers who fell asleep against the windows and had to be told their stop twice. He liked the old men with their grocery bags who always said thank you when they stepped off, even though they said it to the door more than to him. He liked all of it. He had liked it for 22 years. His mother had died 9 years into his tenure on Route 9. He had taken 1 week off and then come back, and the first morning he pulled out of the Garfield hub he had felt the familiar weight of the wheel in his hands and the familiar geography of the route opening up ahead of him, the same streets, the same stop signs, the same pale light coming up behind the water tower on Chester, and he had been, in some way he could not have named, grateful. The route had held him then. He had held the route in return. That was as close as Curtis Deal ever came to talking about what the work meant. By the time Yvonne made her 12 phone calls, the network she was reaching into had been building without him for years. There was Doris, who had ridden Route 9 every weekday for 8 years to get to the laundry facility on Meridian, where she worked the steam press, and who had once, on a February morning when her coat zipper had snapped in the cold, found a folded $5 bill tucked under the fare box with a note that said, "For a warm coat, no signature," and who had always believed it was him, though he never said a word. There was Ray, who drove a tow truck and had been stuck in a ditch off Chester Street one icy January dawn and had watched the Route 9 bus slow down and the driver climb out in the dark to help him get traction. refusing to leave until the truck was free, and who had then watched the bus complete the rest of the route 9 minutes late and never mentioned it to anyone in dispatch. There was Mrs. Elaine Beaumont, who was 81 years old and had buried her husband the previous spring, and who rode Route 9 every Wednesday to the cemetery at the far edge of the Wycliffe neighbourhood, and whom Curtis had once walked to her seat when the floor was slippery with December rain, taking her elbow the way a son would, and who had never forgotten it. There was a young man named Devon, 23 years old, who had been 16 when he rode Route 9 every morning to the vocational programme across town, and who had been told by Curtis one grey November morning, unprompted, that he had good hands and should find work that used them, and who was now an electrician with his own small crew. Devon had been waiting for the chance to say something about that for 7 years. Yvonne did not organise a party. She did not rent a hall. She did not make a banner or order a sheet cake or send emails to the Transit Authority's Public Relations Department. She simply called each person she knew and told them what day it was, and each of those people called someone else, and by the first week of December, the information had moved through the north side the way information moves in a neighbourhood where people still talk to each other slowly and with care, from porch to porch and break room to break room and across the counter at the corner store. What time does the 9 run? Same time it always has. Be there. The word moved differently through different parts of the neighbourhood. On the blocks nearest Dunbar Street, where people had known Curtis since he was a boy, it moved fast. Through front doors left open in the afternoons and conversations had while taking groceries out of the trunk. On the blocks near the laundry and the hospital it moved through break rooms and shift handoffs, one woman telling the next, "You know the driver on the 9, the one who never rushes the doors. This is his last week." At the hair salon on Vine, 3 women waiting for their appointments agreed in the space of 10 minutes that someone ought to do something and that they would be there. At the barber shop 2 doors down, a man who had never ridden the 9 in his life said he would come because his wife had ridden it for 4 years. While they were saving for a second car and she had talked about the driver, the way she talked about people who had been kind to her in a specific and unforgettable way. None of this was organised. All of it was real. Curtis woke on December 14th at 4 in the morning, the way he's always did. His apartment on Dunbar Street, the same house where he had grown up, smelled of coffee and the wood of old floors. He showered and dressed in his uniform, navy blue with the Transit Authority patch on the shoulder, pressed the way he always pressed it, crease in the trousers sharp as a blade. He poured coffee into his thermos and stood at the window for a moment looking out at the street. Still dark, and he thought about the paperwork Gordon had sent him, the pension summary and the exit interview scheduled for 2 o'clock that afternoon. And he thought about how he would drive in the dark this morning, the same as every other morning. And then he would park the bus in the yard and hand in his keys and walk home on Dunbar Street for the last time as a transit driver. He was not a sentimental man. He was also not entirely all right. He finished his coffee and picked up his thermos and went out the door. He pulled bus 214 out of the Garfield hub at 4:53, running 2 minutes behind on account of a stiff air fitting in the door assembly that Earl had patched but not fully fixed, and he made the note in his log the way he always made notes, methodical, dated, specific. The city outside the windshield was dark and cold, and the first stop, the bench at Polk and Garfield, was lit by a single sodium lamp that turned everything the colour of old paper. He did not expect anyone at that stop. It was not a heavy ridership stop at 5 in the morning. He eased the bus to the curb and opened the doors, and the light from the interior spilled. Out onto the sidewalk, and there were some people standing there. He blinked. 7 people at Polk and Garfield at 5 in the morning was not a number that fit any pattern he knew. He looked at them through the windshield and recognised 2 of them and could not place the others. And then a man in a heavy coat stepped up into the bus and said, "Morning, Mr. Curtis," and held out his hand. Curtis shook it without thinking. The man's name was Anthony, and he had ridden Route 9 4 years ago when he was between cars. And he had brought his daughter with him this morning, a girl of about 10 who was bundled in a purple coat, and who said good morning in a voice that was very serious and careful. Curtis said good morning back to her, and she smiled and sat down, and Anthony took the seat beside her and said nothing more, just settled in with the satisfied air of a man who has done the thing he came to do. The second stop was Garfield and Vine. There were 4 people. 3 of them he knew by face. The 4th was a woman he had never seen who introduced herself as the daughter of a man named Mr. Jefferson, who had ridden Route 9 every day to the VA clinic for 6 years and who had passed away in August. She said her father talked about the bus driver who always called his name when he got off, not the stop, his name, so he would not be embarrassed about missing it. Curtis did not remember doing that. He had done it for several of the older regulars because he had noticed that some of them were hard of hearing and did not want to admit it, and calling a name was gentler than calling it twice. He had not thought anything of it. Jefferson's daughter was crying quietly when she stepped off at the next stop, and she thanked him again from the sidewalk, and he lifted his hand from the wheel and nodded. And he felt something begin to shift inside his chest that he could not immediately name. The third stop was Vine and Meridian. 11 people. He counted them without meaning to. He recognized Doris among them, her face older than the last time he had seen her, but the posture the same, still upright, still composed, and she pressed an envelope into his hand when she boarded and said, "Do not open it now," and he set it on the console, and did not. There was a small boy with Doris, her grandson, she said 7 years old, named after her father. He was missing a front tooth and had brought a hand-drawn card in a crumpled envelope that he held out with both hands and would not let go of until Curtis took it personally. So Curtis held the brake with his left hand and took the card with his right and said, "Thank you, son," and the boy sat back in his seat looking satisfied. The 4th stop was Meridian and Chester, the overpass stop. The one with the broken shelter that the Transit Authority had been promising to fix for 11 years, and had not. Curtis had called the maintenance line about that shelter 14 times. He had the work order numbers written in a notebook in his locker. There were 9 people at that stop, and one of them was a city council aide named Sandra, who had ridden Route 9 during her commute for 2 years, and who leaned in and told him, not loudly, that the shelter replacement had finally been approved and would be installed in the spring. She had pushed the requisition herself after a woman had fallen on the ice beneath the broken awning the previous winter. Curtis looked at her for a moment and then looked back through the windshield and said that was good news. His voice was steady. His hands on the wheel were steady. Under his ribs, something that had been held at a particular tension for a very long time was beginning, very slowly, to release. By the 8th stop, he had stopped being surprised by the numbers and started simply being present for each person who climbed aboard. He was listening in a way he had not listened in years, which was strange because he had always listened. Listening was the whole of the work. But this was different. This was people handing him things that had been carried a long time, and he was taking each one and holding it carefully and saying something back. Not much, because he was not a man of many words, but something, and it was enough. An old woman named Clara, who had ridden the 9 for 12 years and moved to the east side 2 years ago and had come back today, just for this, said she used to look for his bus when she was having a hard morning because the bus being on time meant the day could still go right. A teenager, Jalen, 16, who had never ridden Route 9 before in his life, but whose older brother had told him to be here, said he just wanted to see. He sat in the back and watched and said nothing for 3 stops, and then when Curtis called the Chester overpass stop, Jalen said from the back, "Your voice sounds like everything is going to be okay," and the bus was quiet after that for a moment, and then Curtis said he appreciated that, son, and called the next stop. There is a particular weight that comes from being seen by many people at once, not celebrated, not applauded, not rewarded with a plaque or a certificate or a check, but simply witnessed, recognized, accounted for. He had not known he was waiting for that weight until it arrived, and when it did, he felt it, the way you feel something you have needed for a long time, not dramatically, not with tears immediately, but with a deep settling. The way a house settles after a long winter, finding its true position at last. He drove. He called the stops. He shook hands through the fare box when people offered them, and he took cards and envelopes, and in one case a small jar of homemade plum preserves from a woman named Ruth, who had been making them for 30 years and had brought a jar for the driver. She licked most. He placed them all on the console as the first envelope Doris had given him, and by the time he reached the 10th stop the console was full, and he had moved some of the cards to the metal shelf above the windshield where drivers put their logs, and they fluttered slightly every time the door opened. He thought about his mother at the 11th stop. He thought about how she had ridden this route herself in the early years, before she was too unwell to manage the steps, how she had sat up front and sometimes been the only passenger at 6 in the morning, and he had talked to her the way. He talked to all his passengers, with that professional warmth that was not distant and not personal but something in between, the particular tone of a man doing his job with care, and she had never asked for more than that. She had understood the work in the way she understood everything about him, with a quiet, encompassing respect. He had told her once, near the end, that he thought the route was his. He had meant it as a plain statement of fact, and she had understood it that way, nodding, saying, "Yes, it is," the way she confirmed true things. He had not thought about that conversation in several years. He thought about it now. Between the 12th and 13th stops, at a long red light on Chester, where the road widened before the overpass, Curtis sat with his hands on the wheel and the engine idling, and the interior of the bus quiet behind him, and thought about something he had never quite let himself think all the way through, whether any of it had been worth it. Not the career. He had never doubted the career. The career had been steady and real, and had paid for the house and kept him fed, and given his mother 9 years of health insurance that covered her. Medications and her quarterly cardiology visits. He did not doubt that. He thought about whether the particular texture of it, the warmth of it, the care he had taken with it, the way he had adjusted his speed on a curve because a woman dropped her groceries, the way he had learned the names of the hard-of-hearing regulars and called them by name rather than stop number, the way he had carried a spare umbrella in the luggage bay for 3 winters because a woman with a bad hip had been stuck in the rain at the Chester, stopped twice, whether all of that had landed, whether it had gone anywhere, whether the things you do quietly, without an audience, without expectation, in the particular faith that they are the right things, whether those things leave any mark at all on the world or simply dissipate like heat. The light changed. He drove. And the answer this morning was coming to him one stop at a time. He thought also about the 20 years of mornings that had not been like this morning, the ordinary 5 a.m. Mornings when the route had been simply the route, the dark streets and the cold stops, and the few early riders in their separate silences, the long middle of a shift that had no drama and required no witness, just execution, just presence, just the work being done the right way because it was the work and he was the one doing it. Those years were the majority of what he was. The accumulation of ordinary mornings was the thing that made this morning possible, and he understood that with a clarity he had not expected to feel on this day. You cannot arrive at this without those. The route does not hold you if you have not held it. The stop at Meridian and Dunbar, which was the 14th stop, and the one closest to his childhood home, had 23 people waiting. He knew almost all of them. He had gone to school with 2 of the older ones, or had known their people. A man named Reverend Amos, from the church on the corner, had brought 3 members of his congregation, and a thermos of his own, and he handed Curtis a small card through the door window with a scripture on it, Proverbs 16 verse 3, "Commit your works to the Lord, and your thoughts will be established," and Curtis held it a moment before setting it with the others. His hands were not quite steady now. He was not going to let himself fall apart at the wheel of a bus. That was not who he was. But the steadiness was costing him something, and he knew it and spent it anyway, because there were still 7 stops to go, and he was going to drive. Every one of them the right way. Devon got on at the 16th stop, Meridian and Oak, and he was alone, which was somehow more than if he had brought someone. He was a big young man with work-roughened hands, and he stood in the aisle instead of sitting, down and he said, "Mr. Curtis, I don't know if you remember me." And Curtis said, "I remember you, Devon. You used to take this bus to Lakeview Voc." And Devon looked at the floor and then looked up and said, "You told me I had good hands." He said it simply, without drama, the way you report a fact that changed the shape of your life, he said. "I have my own electrical crew now. 12 guys. I own a van." Curtis looked at him. He said, "That does not surprise me one bit." Devon sat down, then in the front seat, and did not say anything else, but he rode all the way to the end of the line. Yvonne boarded at the 19th stop, the last numbered stop before the Wycliffe terminal, and she was not wearing her dispatch window lanyard, but Curtis recognized her the moment she stepped up. The same brown coat she always wore, the same unhurried way of moving. She put her fare card in the reader and then stood in the aisle and said she hoped he did not mind. He said he did not mind. She said she wanted to be the one to ride to the end today, if that was all right. He said that was all right. She sat down in the seat behind the driver's partition, the same seat where his mother used to sit, and he pulled back into traffic and drove the last 2 miles to Wycliffe Park with Yvonne behind him and Devon in the front seat, and 10 or 12. Other passengers who had stayed on past their stops, simply because they wanted to be there when the bus reached the end. The Wycliffe Park terminal was the last stop, the bench at the eastern edge of the park where the route turned around, and when Curtis swung the bus around and opened the doors and looked out, he saw that there were people standing along the sidewalk all the way back to the street lamp. Not a crowd that had been organized or directed, just people standing, in their coats, in the December cold, because the word had reached them by whatever path it travels, mouth to mouth, block to block. And they had come, Mrs. Elaine Beaumont was there in her good coat, the dark wool one she wore for the cemetery, standing straight and careful in the cold with her cane. Curtis saw her and his breath caught. He had not seen her since September. He stepped down off the bus, and she reached up and took his face in both her hands, and looked at him for a long time without saying anything, and then she patted his cheek once, the way an elder does when words are not the right tool, and he understood everything she meant by it. He stood there at the Wycliffe Park terminal for 40 minutes. His run was complete, his log was filed, Bus 214 was sitting at the curb with the engine idling, and it was no longer his bus, and had not been for the last 10 minutes, strictly speaking, because his shift ended when the route ended, and yet nobody was asking him to leave. Few of the children from the Chester and Polk stop had stayed on all the way to Wycliffe, the ones whose parents had no particular destination, and had simply stayed because it felt right to see it through. The girl in the bear hood coat was sitting in the 3rd row with her mother's arm around her, watching Curtis with the serious attention of a child storing something for later. He saw her when he stepped back on the bus, briefly to retrieve the cards from the overhead shelf, and she said, "Are you sad?" And he thought about it for a moment and said, "Not the way you mean," and she seemed to accept that. He handed her mother the construction paper card to keep, the one the girl had made, because he had 10 others like it, and this one belonged to the child who had thought to make it. The mother started to say something and stopped. She folded the card and put it in her pocket. Gordon, standing to one side, said to Curtis at some point, during those 40 minutes, that he had pulled the complaint log from Curtis's route file to prepare the exit. Documentation, and had found 46 logged maintenance requests over 22 Zs, every one of them properly filed, dated, and followed up on at least once. He said most drivers filed 3 or 4 in a career. He said he did not know what to do with that number except to say it out loud. Curtis said he had a notebook in his locker with the work order numbers if anyone needed them. Gordon said he would keep it on file. Gordon from dispatch had driven out in a supervisor vehicle and was standing off to one side with his hands in his pockets, looking simultaneously, bewildered and moved, which was a combination of expressions Curtis had never seen on the man before. People spoke to him, and he listened and responded and said the names he knew and asked for the names he did not. And he stored them in the place where he stored things that mattered, that specific and reliable interior register that had kept 22 years of faces and needs and small recognitions organized and ready when the moment came. He shook hands and accepted embraces and said, "Thank you" so many times the phrase wore a groove in his voice, and he meant it every single time. Doris's envelope contained a card signed by 41 people, each one with a note beneath the signature, and a gift card to the hardware store on Dunbar because the card said in Doris's handwriting, "We noticed you have been fixing your own porch railing for 3 years, and now you'll have time to finish it." He laughed when he read that. A real laugh, and it surprised him, and it surprised the people near him, and then they laughed too. And the sound of it rose up into the December air, and the bare trees at the edge of Wycliffe Park held it for a moment before letting it go. He drove home that afternoon in his own car, a 12-year-old sedan, the colour of dark slate, and he parked it in the small driveway of the Dunbar Street house and sat in it for a moment before going inside. The exit interview with Gordon had gone quietly. Gordon had shaken his hand at the end and said things he seemed to mean, and Curtis had appreciated that. He had handed in his badge and his keys and his locker combination on a slip of paper, and he had walked out of the Garfield hub into the cold afternoon and gotten into his car and driven home. The house was quiet. It was always quiet. He had lived alone in it for 9 years, since the last of the tenants he rented rooms to had moved on, and the quiet had never bothered him. It was the quiet of a house that had held people and still remembered them. He went inside and set the envelopes and cards on the kitchen table, and the small jar of Flomon preserves from Ruth, and the hand-drawn card from Doris's grandson with his name spelled out in capital. Letters, all 7 letters of it, in red crayon, carefully and with great seriousness. Curtis stood at the table and looked at all of it for a while. Then he put the kettle on. He sat at the kitchen table for a long while after the kettle boiled, with his tea in front of him, going from hot to warm to something close to room temperature while he read through what people had written. Some of it was formal, careful sentences, composed over days, he could tell, words crossed out and rewritten in the margins. Some of it was the quick, honest scrawl of someone who had written in a hurry on a cold morning before boarding the bus. A few lines that said everything they needed to say in plain, ordinary language that did not reach for anything more than what it meant. A man named Terence, whose name he did not remember, but whose face he placed when he read the note, had written, "You were the only part of the morning that was consistent when everything else was falling apart." He did not know which falling apart Terence had meant, and he did not need to know. He set that one aside face up on the table and left it there while he read the others. He did not open everything that night. He opened some of it and saved the rest for the mornings that he knew would be harder, the mornings in January and February when the route would run without him, and he would wake at 4 and lie in the dark listening to the city and not hear his own engine in it. He was not afraid of those mornings, but he was not naive about them either. He was a man who had always been practical about the things that were true. He had a pension and a paid-off house, and a porch railing to finish, and somewhere in his chest a full and proper accounting of 22 years. All of it accounted for now, all of it witnessed and returned and set down in the permanent record that people keep for each other when they decide. Someone was worth the keeping. 6 weeks later, in late January, a letter arrived at the Dunbar Street house from the Transit Authority's district office. It was not from Gordon. It was from the district director, a woman named Patterson who Curtis had met once at a safety briefing 4 years ago and who signed her name in a clear, unhurried hand. The letter was 1 page. It said that Route 9 would be designated a community heritage route, the first in the district, and that the Wycliffe Park Terminal bench would carry a small plaque, approved by the City Parks Commission, with his years of service and a line from the petition that 41 riders had filed in November, a petition Curtis had not known about until this moment. The line from the petition read, "He made the route feel like it belonged to the people who needed it." The letter said that if he was willing, his name would appear on the plaque in the spring, when the Meridian and Chester shelter was also due to be replaced. He was willing. Spring came the way it comes to at part of the city, slow and wet, and then suddenly present. The trees on Dunbar Street, putting out their pale new leaves overnight, as if they had made a private agreement to surprise him. He finished the porch railing in March, taking his time with it. sanding each spindle by hand the way his father had taught him to do woodwork, with the grain never against it. He painted it the same white it had always been. It looked good. It looked like it would hold. He was at the Wycliffe Park terminal. On the April morning they unveiled the plaque, standing in a small group that included Yvonne and Doris and Devon and Mrs. Beaumont and a dozen others, and Gordon, who had brought coffee for everyone, and who seemed to have grown, in the month since December, into a somewhat better version of himself. The plaque was modest, bronze on dark stone, and his name was on it in letters that were neither large nor small, the right size for what it was saying, and beneath his name the line from the petition and the years, 22 of them, laid out in plain numerals that did not need to be anything other than what they were. He stood before it in the April light, and the others stood near him. And nobody said much, because there was not much that needed saying. The plaque was saying it, and it would say it every morning when the Route 9 bus pulled to the curb, and the doors opened and some driver who was not Curtis called the stop, and the people got off and crossed the park on their way to wherever they were going, carrying their lives in the ordinary way people carry them, through the ordinary morning, on an ordinary route that someone had loved for 22 years and made into something worth remembering. Devon drove him home afterward. They did not talk much in the car. Devon had his radio on low, something easy and warm. He pulled up to the Dunbar Street house, and Curtis got out and thanked him, and Devon said any time, "Mr. Curtis, any time at all." Curtis went up the porch steps and put his hand briefly on the newly painted railing, feeling it hold, and went inside. On the kitchen table, still there since December, was the hand-drawn card from Doris's grandson. 7 capital letters in red crayon, his name, spelled out with great seriousness by a child who had learned that some people are worth spelling right. Curtis put his keys on the hook by the door and stood in his quiet house and let the morning settle around him, warm and particular and fully his. Have you ever known someone who did their work so faithfully, for so long, that the whole neighborhood felt it without knowing how to name it? Drop a name in the comments for someone like that. And if this story moved you, there is another one waiting right here that carries the same kind of heart.